Cosmotechnics is a concept which he uses to break open our assumption that there's only one technology, Western technology, but also a technology in China, Japan, India, Brazil, etc. And with this term, he connects the concept of cosmology and technology.
The applications and the objectives by which technology is used is very different. And here we see a lot of competition. So trying to make sense of all of that and understanding how perhaps things could be different. I almost wish that China had taken more of a lead in maintaining some of that uniqueness of China's technological development.
This prompted me to start thinking more about what does that mean actually for the cultural identity from a technological standpoint for people from a relatively small and internationally connected independent country like the Netherlands.
Understanding the grand challenges of geopolitical tensions, ecological crisis, and artificial intelligence requires a planetary thinking. We can rise to them embracing technodiversity, biodiversity, and knowledge diversity. This conversation enters the field of epistemological diplomacy and traces the footsteps of philosopher Yu Hui. In what emerging arena do Europe and China face their entanglement?
Welcome, everyone, to our conversation on technodiversity, in which we will explore different narratives and ideas on the future of technology, diplomacy, and politics. In this conversation, we will dive into a few key concepts of the work of the Chinese-German philosopher Yu Hui. To start, Bart Gulden, who is an advisor at the Dutch SDI Policy Council, will give a short introduction of the work of Yu Hui and therefore on technodiversity.
For several reasons, the work of Yu Hui is interesting. First, because he puts technology at the center of his work. So, needless to say, he's the first or the only one to do so. But unlike much recent work in the philosophy of technology, he moves away from a predominantly empirical approach and approaches technology as a philosophical question in its own right. So, following Heidegger, you could say, where he does not only see technology as technological, but also connects it to a cultural specific history of thought. And the latter also makes his work especially urgent because Wei's thinking simultaneously serves as a bridge between the West and the East. He immerses himself with both Eastern and Western thought. His work, The Question Concerning Technology in China, is therefore still relevant. And in this work, he contrasts the history of China and China's technological thinking with that of the West. So, in doing that, breaking the assumption that there would be only one type of techniques or technology, that of the West. And that also raises the question whether or not we in the West actually understand what is currently happening in China. What does it mean for a country like China with a rich history, also in technological thinking, to plunge fully into developing a technology that comes from the West, such as AI? And Wei, in his work, he tries to answer that question, but also tries to think of alternative paths. So he also thinks about the possibility of different forms of technology, and the term he uses for that is technodiversity. But by different forms or diversity, he doesn't mean different aesthetic aspects or differences in ethics, for instance, but he talks about difference in technological thinking that underlies the development of a technology. And for Wei, this technodiversity is necessary if we are to break out of the totalizing power of the prevailing what he calls current cosmotechnology, of cosmotechnics. So his work focuses on developing a new way and capable of thinking and bring about a rupture in sort of homogeneous becoming of Western technology. But to properly understand what Wei means with technodiversity, we also need to have an understanding of what he means with cosmotechnics. And I would say that Wei tries to open up a new space in which we can think about technology. And in that sense, he's also trying to revitalize philosophy itself. And cosmotechnics is a concept which he uses to break open our assumption that there's only one technology, Western technology, but also a technology in China, Japan, India, Brazil, etc. And with this term, he connects the concept of cosmology and technology. And the assumption is that in an anthropological sense, technology is universal. Every culture has technology and develops technology. So in that sense, there's a technological tendency to the universal. But what form this techniques or technology takes varies from culture to culture because it is intertwined with a specific cosmological conception that is expressed in this specific technology. So every culture also has its own technological facts in the forms of customs and traditions. The question is, what is our contemporary cosmotechnics? And here, Way follows Heidegger in the sense that what he says, what is our contemporary cosmotechnics is Gestell, which means that we see our cosmos as something that is a commodity ready for exploitation. And he also speaks of naturalism, for instance, the separations between nature and culture, and of capitalism as a contemporary cosmotechnic that dominates the planet. But it also leaves then the question, what happens to the other cosmotechnics, for China, for example? And that sort of relates to Way's concept of modernity and modernization. So Way's concept of modernity is the epistemological and methodological break in Europe that occurs in the 16th and 17th century. So instrumental rationality, calculability, those kinds of concepts. Modernity then is the universalization of this particular epistemology. So modernity can be understood as a specific episteme, and then modernization is the process in which the specific approach or methodological approach, epistemological approach spreads around the world through a process of colonization, which is supported, think of cosmotechnics, which is supported by techniques such as navigation techniques and military technologies. And according to Way, this has led to a brutal dismantlement of the classic or more traditional Chinese cosmology. And so he says, quotation mark, China ceases to be China, it becomes instead capitalism with Chinese characteristics. But then the question, of course, is how can we break out of this predicament? How can we break out of this mono-technological condition? And to do so, he introduces the term technodiversity. And since Ray understands technology cosmotechnically, technodiversity is also related to a cosmological diversity. So again, we should not think technodiversity in terms of functions or ethics added to new technological developments, but Way is concerned with the underlying assumptions of a technology, and thus diversity in terms of cosmologies, customs, and very fundamental values. And this also relates to his diversity matrix, as it were. So we can't see technology, cosmology, or for that instance also biology in isolation. So biodiversity, if we want to break out of our ecological catastrophe, presupposes also different ways of thinking. How can we think differently about the relation between humans and non-humans? He calls this noodiversity. But since knowledge is always supported by a technology, this also presupposes technodiversity. So without technodiversity, there will be no diversity, and without no diversity, there can't be any biodiversity. So it's important to see these three things, these three fields, as intertwined with each other. And for Way, the challenge is to create new types of technologies, and so we can restore them to their own locality. We can restore them to their specific cosmology appropriate to the place that they're developed in. And a way to do this for Way is through his concept of epistemological diplomacy. So instead of, let's say, trying to conquer different kinds of thinking, what we did in modernity, and what we did, for instance, in Africa, where we quite literally erased different kinds of traditions and traditions of thinking, we have to engage actively with different kinds of thinking, not only to inform us on what is similar, but also to see what actually is different. Because in ways thinking, these differences, these incompatibilities, as he calls them, they are the basis for diversing our thought, and thus also for diversing the way we might develop new technologies. So we can learn about new ways of thinking, the relationships between human and technology, the relationship between humans and the world, humans and the planet, for instance. For him, the goal is, I would say, is not a universality in terms of what is the same, but a universality in terms of what is the difference. And we need epistemic diplomacy to get to that point. And I think that sort of concludes a short, not complete, but a short introduction into his thinking.
Thank you. Maaike Okano-Heijmans, who's program lead of geopolitics and technology of the geopolitics of technology and digitalization at Clingendael, and also part of the China Knowledge Network. Can you maybe reflect a bit on the ideas that Bart presented on We's work?
What strikes me is that there seem to be different levels of thinking. Because on the one hand, I hear you say that the argument is that we are in a sort of monotechnological world, so suggesting that China has somehow become socialized into this sort of US tech-driven world that we live in. And at the same time, I feel that in my daily work, I'm looking at all of this at a very different level, perhaps, because I see a competition or conflicts emerging, working at a think tank, of course, and doing policy-oriented research and advising public practitioners on how to deal with today's challenges, including in the technological sphere. And here we see that actually the understanding that technology is not neutral, and that tech applications are really diverse. I think Europe is also has been socialized in this US tech-driven technological world. But of course, the big tech companies that are shaping today's world that we live in are not European, they are American. So I don't think we can talk about the West in this case. So we see a lot of convergence on the one hand towards the usage or towards the way that things, the underlying technological sort of developments, but the applications and the objectives by which technology is used is very different. And here we see a lot of competition. So trying to make sense of all of that and understanding how perhaps things could be different. I almost wish that China had taken more of a lead in maintaining some of that uniqueness of China's technological development, because they are the ones, globally thinking, that have invested so much in technological development. And perhaps the fact that it has become too much like the US, that helped us ending up in the conflict that we are in. If they had perhaps developed or stuck to a sort of an approach of their own, maybe we would see less competition.
Jochem de Groot, thank you very much for being here. He's a former diplomat, former lobbyist at Microsoft and Royal Philips, a member of the Advisory Council on International Affairs, and currently also independent strategic advisor on technology, geopolitics, and communications.
I'm currently working on a book reflecting on how specifically Microsoft, where I worked almost for a decade, has become a geopolitical actor, and how it's embedded into societies, education, basically every sort of organization you can think of around the world. And what that means for their cultural infiltration in a variety of different regions. And I'm specifically focusing on the Netherlands as an example of a relatively small but highly digitalized country in Europe, where I worked on achieving and furthering policy goals for Microsoft, working on a whole variety of different topics, where actually this company took a very proactive stance in public debates, in trying to localize their technology, whilst at the same time, the fact that they are so dominant together with AWS and Google, they have a 80% market share in cloud, for example, in the Netherlands, and 70% globally. There's an interesting paradox in the fact that they localize a technological narrative, whilst at the same time making these societies, companies, organizations, and the public sector more dependent on their technology. And this prompted me to start thinking more about what does that mean actually for the cultural identity from a technological standpoint for people from a relatively small and internationally connected and dependent country like the Netherlands. Now, if we look at the age of AI and Gen AI specifically, of course, we all know that OpenAI, is the most dominant player globally, which is also a partner for a company like Microsoft. Is trained mostly or predominantly on English as a language, which also has a lot of very implicit cultural implications for people using it globally. If you look at the way that OpenAI is embedded, for example, in Copilot, Microsoft AI Assistant, and has become the Kleenex for technology. People that I speak to across the Netherlands really think that ChatGPT is AI and vice versa. It has already developed that status. And that also means that when we use it in our daily lives in the Netherlands, we can basically presume that some of the data that is behind the training of these models is mostly Anglo-Saxon, right? And also therefore represents the cultural DNA of the Anglo-Saxon world. And that I find very interesting because it really raises the question, what is still the cultural technological identity of people in Western Northern Europe? And what does that mean for adoption of these technologies? If we look at the work of the UK, I think that's a very interesting phenomenon because basically it assumes that the West is a homogeneous region when it comes to technological adoption. Well, as I said, in Germany and France alone, there are very different perspectives that are nuanced in the way they look at technology and how they want to adopt it.
We have a global versus local paradox. Like from the perspective of Cosmolab, a diplomat should position him or herself exactly within this tension, because you need to understand both like this global universalizing tendencies of technology, but also be sensitive to the cultural or cosmological or local context. What should a diplomat do to mediate these differences?
When it comes to diplomacy, I worked in diplomacy for a couple of years, right? We've come to a stage at which indeed the multilateral world order has a total different meaning as to how we look at values, right? So when I was a diplomat, we looked at internet freedom as a North Star, a lodestar for countries around the world, basically exporting, the interpretation of freedom of speech and expression from the West to countries around the world. We're currently, of course, in a very different geopolitical reality in which there are all kinds of different ways in which people approach digital means in expressing values, and I'm really cognizant of the fact that the fact that the West used to operate as a bloc in this is also kind of no longer true, right? So if we look at the tensions between Europe and the United States, for example, if you look at privacy, there has been a lot of tension between the US and Europe when it comes to sharing data across the Atlantic and the way this has to be done, whereby there's a constant back and forth in which I would also dare say that some of these American companies, for mostly transactional reasons, have come to understand that they must provide a proposition that respects privacy from a European values perspective, right? So that's also the fundament of Anu Bradford's first book, The Brussels Effect. If we create technology regulation that is so powerful that companies that want to do business in our neck of the woods are going to adopt it globally, and that's going to have an exporting effect of our values. When it comes to AI, a little bit further down the road, unfortunately, I've not seen any of these big tech companies say that they're going to approach AI from a European regulatory perspective as of yet. And that is because they are also operating in different regions of the world that are developing their own AI propositions that are actually very culturally sensitive. So an example of this is for the United Arab Emirates that are developing Falcon 42, which is an open source LLM, which is quite powerful, but that has become the battleground between the US and China, where the Chinese government and companies had invested quite a bit in that region, and that the local AI company of the United Arab Emirates. And Microsoft was then used by the US government to kind of intervene and push out some of the dependencies on Chinese technology in that region. And then the narrative that goes along with that is that this is a region that has very different cultural backgrounds and values as does Europe. That in a polarized or decoupled world between China and the US, this is kind of a third or even a fourth region. Whereby there's a new, let's say, narrative developing on how can we use technology in this region to develop and also be a stepping stone to the global south, right? So the level playing field is no longer level as it used to be, and that also implies to get a better understanding of where we can find common ground.
Can I add to that?
Yeah.
I think what is really important, and it's just a very basic sort of insight, is, understanding diversity is important. Seeing diversity is important. I think that's the key message that we should share with others. I've been teaching non-Western diplomacy for 10 years at the University of Leiden. And I see that even today, when we read a lot on a daily basis, also in newspapers here in the Netherlands and throughout Europe, especially about China, but also about other countries, most of us tend to think that we understand sort of those other countries with other thoughts. But if I delve one level deeper with my students, you find out that that is really not so much the case. If you have not visited many of these countries, and that goes for the US also, but especially countries in Asia or in the global south, it's just very difficult to understand. And this is the case for students, but it's also the case for diplomats, I would dare argue even. And that's perhaps a bit far going to some, but understanding, for example, that the way that the Western countries developed our international relations system that exists today with all institutions, so very top down, that is one way of doing things. You don't have to create institutions. It can also be done bottom up governance, right? And that is, I think, what many countries in Asia, including China, have been trying to do, and that has been changing the world in the past 10 years. And the same goes for strategic thinking and games, right? It's an analogy that I also often give, where our strategic game of is chess, of course, here in Europe. But think of that as that's not the game that is played throughout the world in Asian countries. It's Go or Weiqi, if you want to use the Japanese or the Chinese terminology, and that's a very different game as such, where it's more networked. It's not one king that if you topple him or her, you lose or you are about to lose the game. It's a way of encircling others and challenging your opponent. Understanding that diversity, because we need to understand that this diversity has consequences, and the consequences we see in differences in standardization. Right, the fact that we build railway networks in many parts of the world, and the fact that we build ports, or we help to build ports with containers of a standard that we set, has helped us a lot, right, when we trade with other countries. China is now doing the same in the digital domain. So they are setting standards that help their own companies. And that's totally understandable. It's their right. And if other countries wish to accept that, that's nothing we should be, we can counter. But we need to realize that this comes with consequences for our sort of interoperability, compatibility with those countries. And if it's just the size of a container, you might think, okay, we can adjust that. But if it's actually about how do you organize your digital society on transparency, on freedom of speech online, there's perhaps more to be said about, well, maybe we should invest a little bit more in making sure that also our standards are ingrained in standards that others adopt, because the world will change as others will adopt standards, that are not ours. And I think that is sort of a key point that many of us still have to sort of come to grips with, that also, well, practitioners, and Dutch governments, institutions, but also the EU at large are finally starting to sort of see, but we're not really getting, I think, the depth of that change. And so I'm hoping that our discussion today can help contribute to that.
I think the example of the difference between chess and AlphaGo is super interesting because, of course, AlphaGo, the program was developed by sort of as a goal to correct the code of Go. And that, I think it shows also the hubris in our Western technology, that we can think that if we use our own technology with our own assumptions, epistemological assumptions, we can understand what's happening in the other game, and we can beat the game as well. But it says something about our own attitude towards these different kinds of, let's say, cultural specificities, for instance, because we have to understand what we're actually doing if we apply a program such as AlphaGo to a game of Go. We're making it calculable. So we're sort of destroying let's say, its authentic nature, and sort of sublating it into our own ways of thinking. And that's the hubris, which is, I think, the danger if you talk about this sort of engaging with different types of cultures and thinking and diplomacy. It's thinking that our own technology is neutral, but we're actually sort of sublating something else into our own ways of understanding reality.
This is something that's come up in a variety of different sectors, also in the United States, in the criminal justice sector, right, where automating inequalities is a very big issue as well. And just the solutionism that's behind the technology simply as it's become available, right, and therefore seems to have to be used, is something that's now so part of our European culture as well, that I think it merits asking very critical questions. In Europe, we have to build our own alternatives, but we're going to be dealing with, the non-European sources of technology for a really long time, right? So you have to also be realistic and pragmatic, which is something I think you wrote, Maaike, in your report that came out the day before yesterday again, which I completely agree with. But what you can do is say, okay, to what extent can we adopt some of these technologies in our own competitiveness in Europe, right? Which is really where we need to up our game. But then you can also really embed that with our cultural values and the way that we look at, for example, how a society should operate and how a public sector should provide services to its citizens. That you can be more efficient, but at the same time, you can also make sure that it's respectful of a variety of cultural values that are shared across the European Union, in which our regulation also helps us to give boundaries, right? So I think that we do have the capacity in Europe to become more productive with technology, and also add a further layer of applying it in a technological culture that better fits our own European values. I think there's a really an upside to the fact that we are now forced by the external world to think about this more critically from an economic standpoint, as well as from a geopolitical standpoint, to also take on board our cultural perspectives on this. And I think a country like the Netherlands, which is always, quick to adopt, innovate, can be a good leader in this sense, right? We're listed as the #1 responsible AI country in the world last year. Which is, of course, something that we can try and build with our sandboxing, which, of course, is an important element of trying to make the AI Act come alive, and export those types of experiments in the way we think about technology from a European identity perspective across the European Union.
Yeah, maybe the last thing to add also from the thinking of Ukwe is that if you look at this diversity matrix, it tells us that all these different kinds of fields are intertwined with each other. So if we think about technology, it also means we have to think about thinking itself. And it also means we have to think about nature and our relationship to the world as well. We can't see these things as separate domains. We have to engage with them simultaneously and continuously.
Maaike, what would your suggestion be for Cosmolab?
The question that I ask myself often that I would like to bring in is, what is it that I wish to cherish about, the digital society of the future? What kind of digital society do I want my children to grow up in or to live in the future? And that is, I think, a way of discovering my own sort of techno-identity, understanding what I hold dearly, and then as a next step, of course, thinking about, okay, what's my role in making sure that we preserve this or that we actually get to that? Because I think to some extent we have lost that, our own identity, so we're trying to regain it. What can I do? This is a key driver in my work, and I think it would be great if all of us start to think of things in those terms, because then, you know, small things coming together can make big change.
Thank you very much for your time, but mostly for your inspiration. I think it was a very fascinating talk, a lot of beautiful ideas. So on behalf of the Cosmolab and China Knowledge Network, again, thank you very much.